The great irony of the 21st century is that the world's most powerful nation finds itself vulnerable not to conventional military threats, but to sophisticated hybrid warfare operating beneath the threshold of traditional conflict. For decades, the United States has participated in destabilizing foreign governments through economic pressure, information operations, and strategic deployment of non-governmental organizations. These same mechanisms have now been turned inward, creating a sovereignty crisis that threatens the foundation of the American Republic. This is not conspiracy theory, but sober assessment of observable trends demanding immediate attention from anyone concerned with the future of the United States as a coherent nation-state. True sovereignty in the 21st century requires control over population, enforcement of domestic policy without external influence, preservation of cultural cohesion, and ensuring that power remains responsive to national interest rather than transnational networks. By every measure, the United States is experiencing dramatic erosion that would have seemed unthinkable 2 decades ago. These mechanisms operate simultaneously across economic, demographic, informational, and political domains. What makes this dangerous is that it has proceeded largely without recognition, camouflaged by the assumption that a nation as powerful as the United States is immune to destabilization techniques. This assumption is catastrophically incorrect, as the openness and institutional complexity that once constituted American strengths have been weaponized into vulnerabilities. The southern border represents the most visible manifestation of sovereignty under assault. Mainstream discourse treats this as primarily humanitarian or policy disagreement, but this framing misses the strategic dimension. Mass movement of millions across the border without documentation constitutes weaponized migration on unprecedented scale. This serves multiple strategic purposes for various actors who benefit from destabilization. The immediate effect creates a massive population within American borders whose loyalties, cultural reference points, and economic interests remain oriented toward countries of origin, creating a parallel society existing alongside but separate from traditional American civic culture. This population, concentrated in specific regions, represents what strategists would term a potential fifth column, not because individuals are necessarily hostile, but because their presence creates structural vulnerabilities exploitable during crisis. Criminal cartels from Mexico have achieved territorial control over portions of the American Southwest, rivaling United States government authority. These organizations generate revenues exceeding many nations' GDP, demonstrating sophisticated capabilities in communications, logistics, and corruption of American officials. Millions of undocumented individuals create perfect environment for these organizations, providing both population to exploit and chaos, making effective law enforcement nearly impossible. Foreign intelligence services understand migration flows, provide perfect cover for inserting operatives, establishing support networks, and pre-positioning capabilities useful in future conflicts. Complete absence of vetting means the United States has effectively allowed any adversary to establish operational presence within American territory. Beyond direct security implications, weaponized migration serves broader strategic purpose in fragmenting American society. Rapid demographic transformation creates social tension, strains public services, and generates political conflict, consuming enormous energy. School systems become overwhelmed, healthcare facilities struggle, local governments face fiscal crises as costs explode while revenues stagnate. These pressures create perfect conditions for social breakdown and parallel economies. Justice systems and social structures are already emerging. The question is whether this outcome is accidental or by design. When policies creating these conditions are championed by entities claiming to represent American interests while systematically undermining sovereignty, the answer becomes clear. Economic dimensions reveal troubling patterns, particularly regarding energy policy. The United States briefly achieved energy independence through domestic production, freeing foreign policy from dependence on hostile suppliers. This achievement is being systematically dismantled through regulatory pressure, financial manipulation, and ideological campaigns convincing Americans that domestic energy production threatens existence. Parallels to Venezuela are striking. Just as external powers sought control over Venezuelan resources by creating chaos, then offering infrastructure help in exchange for access, similar patterns emerge domestically with greater sophistication. Renewable energy push, presented as environmental necessity, practically makes the United States dependent on supply chains controlled by foreign powers, particularly China dominating solar panel, wind turbine, and rare earth element production essential to batteries. This doesn't argue against renewables, but observes the transition manner transfers American energy sovereignty externally. Domestic oil and gas production is systematically restricted through regulatory barriers, financial pressure on lenders, and infrastructure prohibition. Meanwhile, same interests promote increased foreign energy dependence through continued oil imports or renewable infrastructure requiring ongoing foreign purchases. The result transfers both wealth and strategic control away from Americans toward interests with no loyalty to national well-being. What makes this insidious is marketing these policies as serving national interest when doing precisely the opposite. Environmental protection language obscures fundamental economic transfer and sovereignty reduction. American workers lose high-paying energy employment, facing dependence on government support or service sector jobs with lower living standards. Consumers face rising energy costs, making domestic manufacturing uncompetitive while enriching foreign producers. Strategic planners face futures where crisis response is constrained by supplier goodwill. This serves someone's interests, but not the long-term well-being of a sovereign United States. Policy mechanisms lead to another critical dimension, ostensibly independent organizations shaping American policy while operating with funding and direction from sources whose interests diverge from the American people. Non-governmental organizations have become among the most powerful and least understood forces in contemporary politics. These entities range from small activist groups to massive foundations with budgets exceeding many nations, operating in regulatory gray zones where they enjoy tax-exempt status and claim grassroots representation while serving as elite influence vehicles. The Iran situation, where foreign-funded NGOs allegedly organized protest movements for government destabilization, provides useful templates, though the American context is more complex because organizations are nominally domestic. Consider Washington's think tank ecosystem. These organizations produce research informing congressional testimony, draft legislation language, provide regulatory agency experts, and supply administration personnel regardless of party. On paper, they're independent scholars pursuing truth. In reality, they're heavily funded by wealthy individuals and foundations whose interests don't necessarily align with ordinary Americans. When billionaire technology executives fund think tanks advocating increased immigration while their companies benefit from abundant low-wage workers, this isn't independent scholarship, but self-interest laundering through objective analysis facade. When foundations advocate environmental policies disadvantaging competitors while advantaging their business, this isn't altruism, but strategic positioning disguised as public service. These organizations' power derives from claiming neutrality while advancing specific agendas and creating manufactured consensus, funding multiple organizations approaching issues differently, but reaching similar conclusions creates apparent broad-based expert agreement. Media organizations owned by individuals with policy preferences report manufactured consensus as genuine expert opinion, and policymakers cite coverage as evidence of following science or respecting expertise. The result is a closed loop where money shapes research, research shapes media, media shapes public opinion, and public opinion provides cover for policies serving the wealthy while imposing costs on everyone else. This isn't healthy republic functioning, but precisely how sophisticated influence operations work, and domestic rather than foreign operation makes it more dangerous. Many organizations shaping American policy maintain close relationships with foreign governments and international institutions whose interests may conflict with American sovereignty. The revolving door between NGO positions, international organization roles, and senior American government positions creates networks whose worldview is fundamentally globalist rather than nationalist. When trade agreements are negotiated by individuals soon returning to multinational corporations or international law firms, agreements unsurprisingly advantage mobile capital over rooted communities. When immigration policy is shaped by individuals moving between business-funded advocacy organizations and government positions with enforcement authority, enforcement becomes discretionary and systematically underperforms. This leads to the most sophisticated destabilization mechanism, using information technology and artificial intelligence to fragment American society and make collective action effectively impossible. Bot farm and troll operation revelations in other countries provide frameworks for understanding domestic occurrences, though the American situation is more complex because much operation is domestic, even if serving foreign interests. Social media platform business models built on engagement mean emotionally provocative content is systematically amplified regardless of productive or destructive consequences. This creates environments where extreme voices on every issue receive maximum attention, while moderate positions forming compromise bases are suppressed. The result is a population sorted into hostile tribes, literally unable to communicate, because they don't share common facts about the world. This isn't accident, but predictable consequence of algorithms designed to maximize engagement without regard for social cohesion. Foreign actors have exploited this vulnerability, using modest troll farm and bot network investments to amplify divisions and push society toward extremes. But bulk work is done by American citizens manipulated by systems exploiting human psychology for profit. This serves foreign interests while enriching American technology companies, perfectly exemplifying how entities claiming to serve American innovation actually undermine social cohesion necessary for national functioning. Artificial intelligence deployment takes these dynamics to dangerous new levels. Technology now generates seemingly authentic content at scale, creates false evidence of non-existent events, impersonates individuals convincingly, and targets specific populations with messages exploiting particular vulnerabilities. Political campaign use is well documented, but this represents only obvious application. Imagine genuine crisis scenarios where population collective response is undermined by AI-generated content sowing confusion and distrust. Emergency communications competing with sophisticated deep fakes, showing officials giving contradictory orders or admitting fictional conspiracies. Community leaders unable to organize because communications are drowned by bot noise or AI impersonations destroying credibility. These aren't hypothetical scenarios, but realistic assessments of existing capabilities already being deployed. Infrastructure for comprehensive information warfare against Americans is operational, and ostensibly American company control provides little comfort when companies repeatedly demonstrate valuing growth and profit over national responsibility. Foreign intelligence services certainly access these tools and have every incentive using them to advance interests at American expense. The United States enters periods where democratic governance prerequisites, notably shared reality understanding and rational collective deliberation ability, are systematically undermined by technologies whose deployment is driven by profit motives and strategic calculations having nothing to do with American well-being. What we witness isn't discrete policy failures or unfortunate trends, but systematic sovereignty hollowing through mechanisms operating below conventional threat recognition thresholds. Border control loss, energy independence transfer to foreign dependency, policy process capture by elite serving influence networks, and shared reality fragmentation through information warfare aren't separate problems but interconnected elements of broader patterns. Each reinforces others. Open borders make social cohesion harder, making policies advantaging mobile capital over rooted communities easier, creating economic anxiety exploitable through information operations, further dividing populations and making collective responses more difficult. The result is downward spirals, where each turn makes recovery harder and next turns more severe. Breaking this spiral requires fundamental reassessment of contemporary sovereignty, meaning, and willingness to prioritize national coherence over various interests benefiting from American fragmentation. This begins with sovereignty's most basic element, border control and population composition control. Nations unable to determine who enters territory and under what conditions aren't fully sovereign. This isn't about xenophobia or ethnic purity, but basic requirement that political communities make decisions about composition and ensure joiners embrace values and contribute to well-being. Current situations where millions enter illegally and establish themselves without vetting or integration are incompatible with long-term national survival. Restoring border control must be understood not as peripheral policy preference, but existential necessity. This cannot be accomplished through half measures or symbolic gestures, but requires political will to enforce existing law, complete physical barriers where appropriate, dramatically expand border security and immigration enforcement resources, and most importantly, create political environments where anyone employing illegal immigrants faces severe consequences, making such employment economically irrational. Illegal labor demand drives much illegal immigration, and as long as employers benefit from hiring undocumented workers at below-market wages, incentive structures will continue producing observed outcomes. Breaking this dynamic requires making illegal hiring costlier than legal hiring through serious, actually deployed enforcement mechanisms. Energy sovereignty must be restored as strategic priority rather than sacrificed to ideological commitments or corporate interests benefiting from dependence. This doesn't mean abandoning renewable energy development or ignoring environmental concerns, but recognizing American strategic autonomy depends on meeting energy needs from domestic sources during transition periods. Policies restricting domestic production while increasing foreign supplier dependence are indefensible from national security perspectives, regardless of public marketing. The United States has abundant energy resources, and developing those resources creates jobs, generates wealth, and provides strategic flexibility for pursuing foreign policy objectives without placating energy suppliers. Any energy policy not beginning from this premise is fundamentally unserious about American sovereignty. NGO and think tank roles in shaping policy must face dramatically increased scrutiny and regulation. Organizations engaging in political advocacy shouldn't enjoy tax-exempt status. Organizations receiving foreign funding should register as foreign agents and be prohibited from domestic political activities. The revolving door between policy advocacy organizations and government positions should close through strict cooling-off periods and conflict of interest rules. Most importantly, Americans need much more sophisticated understanding of how manufactured consensus operates and how to identify when ostensibly independent organizations actually serve specific interests. Contemporary media literacy must include tracing funding sources and recognizing when research conclusions align suspiciously well with funder interests. Addressing information warfare requires both technological and cultural responses. Technologically, serious consideration must be given to regulating social media platforms, preserving free speech while preventing systematic public discourse manipulation through bot networks, algorithmic extremism amplification, and deceptive AI-generated content. This is difficult territory, as speech regulation creates abuse and censorship risks. But current situations where a handful of companies have rewired human social interaction, systematically advantaging engagement over truth and conflict over cooperation, is also unacceptable. At minimum, transparency requirements should allow users understanding when content has been algorithmically amplified, when accounts are likely bots rather than humans, and when material has been AI-generated or manipulated. Beyond this, consideration may be needed whether platforms becoming essential public discourse infrastructure should be treated as utilities subject to common carrier obligations rather than purely private entities free to shape discourse according to business interests. Culturally, rebuilding shared reality requires restoring trusted institutions and cultivating intellectual virtues systematically undermined by polarization and information warfare. This is perhaps the most difficult challenge because trust, once lost, is extremely hard to rebuild. It requires institutions demonstrating consistent commitment to truth over tribal loyalty, acknowledging uncertainty rather than presenting everything with false confidence, and visibly prioritizing public service over self-interest. It requires educational systems teaching critical thinking rather than ideological conformity, cultivating ability to engage opposing viewpoints rather than dismissing them, and instilling shared national identity rather than fragmenting students into competing identity groups. It requires media organizations seeing their role as informing the public rather than confirming pre-existing biases or pursuing ideological agendas. None of this will be easy, and all will face fierce resistance from those benefiting from current trajectories. Interests profiting from open borders will deploy every tool preventing meaningful enforcement. Interests benefiting from energy dependence will wrap themselves in environmental rhetoric preventing domestic production restoration. Influence networks shaping policy through ostensibly independent organizations will fight to preserve opacity, allowing them to operate. Technology companies whose business models depend on engagement, regardless of social cost, will resist any meaningful regulation. These are formidable opponents controlling many commanding heights of American society, from media platforms to academic institutions to significant political system portions. But the alternative to confronting these interests is accepting continued American sovereignty erosion until the United States is no longer capable of acting as independent nation pursuing citizens' interests. Current trajectories lead to futures where America exists as geographic expression rather than coherent political community, a place where various populations coexist without shared identity or common purpose, where policy is set by influence networks answerable to no electorate, where information space is so polluted that collective action becomes impossible, and where basic government functions are either captured by narrow interests or simply cease functioning. This isn't distant dystopia, but realistic projection of current trends if unchecked. The good news is that awareness of these dynamics is growing. More Americans recognize something fundamental has gone wrong, the nation is on unsustainable paths, and dramatic changes are necessary. This awareness creates openings for political movements prioritizing national sovereignty and popular well-being over elite network preferences. But awareness alone is insufficient. It must be channeled into concrete policy changes and institutional reforms addressing structural sovereignty erosion sources rather than treating symptoms. This requires political leadership willing to name problems clearly, identify interests benefiting from current arrangements, and build coalitions capable of overcoming resistance meaningful reform will inevitably face. The challenge facing the United States in coming years is nothing less than preserving national sovereignty in an era when that concept is under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Hybrid warfare tools once deployed against distant nations are now hollowing out American power from within, proving devastatingly effective. But the United States has faced existential challenges before and found resources to overcome them. What is required now is the same clear-eyed reality recognition, the same willingness to name threats directly, and the same determination to do what is necessary regardless of difficulty. The American Republic was built by people understanding that self-government requires eternal vigilance and that freedom depends on willingness to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That understanding must be recovered and applied to present era challenges if the United States is to survive as sovereign nation capable of charting its own course and serving citizens' interests. The alternative is slow dissolution into irrelevance, a fate representing not just American tragedy but global one. For all the flaws and failures of the United States, the world emerging from American collapse would be far more dangerous and far less free than the one we currently inhabit.